I bent down slowly, heart pounding, as the broken lenses scattered across the marble floor. My glasses, crushed beneath her heel, deliberate and cold. "You don't deserve these," she said, with a smirk meant to slice deeper than the glass. My son stood there, silent, eyes cast down like a child caught between truth and cowardice. That's when I knew. If I was invisible in this house, then so was she. In my will. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. The Hayes dining room was polished to perfection, as though Catherine had staged it for a magazine shoot instead of a family dinner. The chandelier glowed faintly golden, the stemware sparkled, and the linen napkins had been folded into stiff little triangles. Yet despite all that gleam, Margaret felt like an uninvited guest at her own son's table. She sat at the far end, straight-backed, her silver-gray bob catching the light whenever she tilted her head. The roast chicken in the center of the table smelled of rosemary and garlic, but her appetite had slipped away the moment she noticed Catherine's thin smile, sharp as a blade. Michael busied himself with pouring wine. He hadn't met his mother's eyes since she'd walked in. Catherine, on the other hand, never looked away. Every word she spoke carried a brittle sweetness, like spun sugar ready to shatter. Margaret adjusted her glasses, more out of habit than need, and picked at the salad on her plate. The conversation circled around Catherine's new business venture, a boutique she claimed would redefine the neighborhood. She spoke in grand, sweeping tones, as though Margaret were an audience rather than family. Halfway through Catherine's monologue, a sharp clink broke the rhythm. Margaret's glasses, her reading glasses, the pair her late husband had once teased her about, saying she looked too bookish to be dangerous, slid from the edge of the table. Before she could react, they hit the hardwood floor. The lenses were intact. They could have been retrieved, dusted, and returned, but Catherine's chair scraped back with deliberate force. She rose, heel clicking against the floor, and with one precise motion, she pressed her stiletto down on the frames. The crunch echoed louder than any dinner conversation should allow. Michael froze mid-pour, the stream of wine trembling against the rim of a glass. Catherine looked straight at Margaret, her lips curving into that cruel, practiced smirk. "You don't deserve these," she said, her voice low but cutting, like glass dragged across stone. The room went silent, except for the faint hiss of the roasting pan cooling in the kitchen. Margaret felt heat crawl up her neck, not from anger, but from the weight of humiliation. She could sense her son watching her from the corner of his eye, desperate to avoid the fallout. Her first instinct was to rise, to defend herself, to demand that Michael open his mouth. Instead, she did what years of library work had taught her. She moved quietly, efficiently, with no wasted words. She bent down, hands steady despite the trembling in her chest, and gathered the broken frames piece by piece. One arm of the glasses had twisted grotesquely out of shape, but she laid it gently across her palm as though it still mattered. Catherine sat again, triumphant in her silence, her fork clinking against the china as though nothing had happened. Michael shifted, his throat tightening as if he wanted to speak, but his lips never parted. Margaret straightened slowly, sliding the fragments into her purse. She lifted her chin, meeting no one's gaze, and resumed her place at the table. The salad before her had wilted in the candlelight. For the remainder of the meal, conversation stumbled forward. Michael asked about the boutique again, his voice thin, eager to smooth over the scene. Catherine responded with exaggerated brightness, as if stepping on her mother-in-law's dignity had been nothing more than brushing away crumbs. Margaret chewed in silence. The food might as well have been paper in her mouth. The humiliation still burned under her skin, but outwardly she was a statue, carved from patience and restraint. When the plates were cleared and dessert was mentioned, Margaret declined. Her tone was even, polite, almost pleasant, because composure was the one thing Catherine could not take from her. She placed her napkin on the table, smoothed the crease, and rose with deliberate calm. Catherine's smirk flickered, almost imperceptibly. Michael didn't move. Margaret's hand brushed the weight of the broken glasses in her purse as she turned toward the door. She paused, just for a breath, at the threshold of the dining room, her gaze catching the chandelier's reflection in the window pane. The glass sparkled, whole, unbroken. Then she stepped out into the night air, cool and sharp against her face, leaving behind the suffocating perfume of rosemary and false civility. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was a choice, and in that silence, something shifted, quiet but irrevocable. The door clicked shut behind her, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt the faint spark of a resolve she hadn't needed since her husband's passing. The morning fog still clung to San Francisco streets as Margaret walked up the stone steps of Samuel Green's office. The city hummed awake around her, horns echoing down Market Street, the faint clang of a cable car bell in the distance, but she carried none of that noise with her. Her steps were measured, her posture rigid, her purse heavy with the broken glasses she hadn't been able to bring herself to throw away. Inside, Samuel's office was warm, lined with dark oak shelves filled with volumes of law. The faint scent of leather and old paper mixed with the sharp tang of fresh coffee. Samuel rose from behind his desk, a tall man with thinning hair and a presence that was both reassuring and formidable. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "You look like you haven't slept," he said gently, settling back into his leather chair. Margaret sat, smoothing her skirt with a precise motion. Her face was calm, almost serene, but her eyes carried the storm of the previous night. For a moment, she simply rested her hands on her lap, the silence heavy between them. Then, in a voice as cold as steel, she said, "I'm done. Catherine's out of the will." Samuel studied her carefully, his brow knitting slightly. "That's a serious step, Margaret. Are you sure this is the road you want to take?" Her lips tightened. The image of her glasses under Catherine's heel flashed like a photograph in her mind. The sound of the crunch, Michael's silence, the smirk that still burned behind her eyes. She spoke without hesitation. "She has no respect for me, and she doesn't deserve anything." Samuel leaned back, fingers steepled under his chin. He'd known Margaret for decades, since she and her husband had first come to him to draw up their initial estate plans. He'd seen her as a devoted wife, a protective mother, a pillar of quiet strength. Today she was something else entirely, a woman whose patience had been crossed past the point of return. "Very well," he said at last. "If this is what you want, we'll begin the paperwork immediately. I'll make sure it's airtight. No loopholes, no room for argument." Margaret exhaled slowly, a controlled release, as though she'd been holding her breath since last night. She opened her purse and withdrew the mangled frames, placing them on the desk between them. One lens was cracked clean through the center, a jagged scar that caught the light. "She did this," Margaret murmured, almost to herself. Then she looked up, her gaze unwavering. "And I won't let her do worse. Not to my memory, not to what I've built, not to Michael, even if he's too weak to see it right now." Samuel nodded, his jaw set. He reached for his pen, flipping open a leather-bound notebook. "I'll draft the amendments. You'll need to review and sign. Once filed, it'll stand." As his pen scratched across the paper, Margaret's eyes drifted to the framed photograph on the corner of his desk. It was one she'd seen countless times, a candid shot of her late husband, George, grinning with his arm thrown around her shoulders, taken on their last vacation before his heart gave out. Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away. She leaned forward, her fingertips brushing the edge of the frame as though grounding herself. "George would want me to do this," she said softly, almost reverently. "He'd never forgive me for letting her poison our family. This isn't just about money. It's about dignity." Samuel lowered his pen and met her gaze. "Then dignity you'll have. Leave Catherine to me." Margaret straightened, her composure intact, though her pulse thrummed with something fierce beneath it. For years she had swallowed insults, tolerated Catherine's sharp edges for the sake of peace. But peace had shattered with the crunch of glass under a stiletto heel. As Samuel slid a folder across the desk toward her, the weight of her choice settled in, not as a burden, but as armor. She signed where he pointed, her hand steady, each stroke of the pen a severing of ties. When it was done, she capped the pen, placed it neatly beside the papers, and sat back. The fog outside had begun to lift, sunlight slicing through the window blinds, striping Samuel's desk in pale gold. Margaret glanced once more at her husband's photo. The ghost of a smile touched her lips, not of joy but of grim resolve. "Let her think she's won," she whispered. her voice almost lost to the quiet room. She has no idea what's coming. 2 days later, Margaret returned to Samuel's office, the fog thinner this time, as if the city itself had decided to reveal more of its edges. She felt sharper too, less weighed down by shock, more defined by resolve. The broken glasses no longer rattled in her purse. She had left them at home on her mantle, a reminder of the line that had been crossed. Samuel stood by the window when she entered, his profile etched against the pale morning light. On the desk lay a neatly stacked set of documents, clipped and ordered, their presence commanding the room more than any conversation could. "Margaret," he greeted, his tone both professional and quietly respectful. He pulled out the chair across from him. "It's ready." She sat, her hands folded, eyes narrowing on the folder before him. Samuel slid it across the polished wood, the papers whispering against one another. "This," he said, tapping the top page, "is the amended will. Every line, every clause, drafted to reflect your decision. Catherine Hayes is no longer a beneficiary in any form." Margaret's gaze traveled down the dense text, the legal phrasing cold but precise. She paused at the paragraph where Catherine's name should have been. It wasn't simply crossed out. It was absent, erased as if she had never been part of Margaret's life. The weight of it settled in Margaret's chest like stone, her lips pressed into a line. "She doesn't deserve a single penny." Samuel leaned back slightly, watching her with the patience of someone who had witnessed many battles fought on paper long before they reached a courtroom. "And she won't get one. I've made sure of it." Margaret lifted her eyes from the text. "Catherine will try." "You know she will. She'll twist Michael against me if she has to." "I know her type," Samuel replied, his voice clipped but steady. "But I also know the law. These documents are airtight. No loopholes, no ambiguities. Even the most aggressive attorney won't find a way through. This isn't just strong, it's ironclad." For the first time since that dinner, Margaret allowed herself to lean back in her chair. The tension in her shoulders eased, not entirely, but enough that her hands unclenched from the edge of the folder. She took in a slow breath, the air cool in her lungs, steadying. She looked once more at the page, imagining Catherine's face when she eventually learned. That smirk would falter, the entitlement would wither, and Margaret would not need to raise her voice to achieve it. "I can live with this," she said quietly. Samuel adjusted his glasses, sliding the signed page into the folder with the rest. "This is final, Margaret. If she ever tries to contest, she'll embarrass herself. No court will side with her. She has nothing to stand on." The words, "nothing to stand on," lingered in the air, sharper than the ink on the page. Margaret thought of Catherine's heels, crushing the frames into splinters. Now, it would be Catherine left with shards slipping through her fingers, powerless to piece them back together. Samuel closed the folder with a firm tap, sealing more than just papers. He met Margaret's eyes. "Consider this the line in the sand." Margaret rose, smoothing the front of her coat, her expression unreadable, but her eyes alight with a cold fire. She reached for the folder, her fingers brushing the leather cover, but then pulled back. "Keep it here, safer with you." Samuel nodded. "It's done." As she turned to leave, the photograph of George caught her eye again. She paused, letting the moment anchor her. He had built a life of quiet steadiness, and she had spent years preserving it. But this was her turn to protect it. Not with patience, but with finality. The sun broke stronger through the blinds, striping her face with alternating light and shadow as she stepped toward the door. She gripped the handle, a flicker of satisfaction curling at the edges of her composure. Behind her, Samuel stacked the folder among his other cases, his voice calm but resolute. "No one will ever find a loophole." Margaret opened the door, her silhouette framed against the brightness of the hall. She didn't smile, but her silence carried something heavier, a sense of power reclaimed. Margaret sat by the bay window of her home, the late afternoon light spilling across the polished wood floor. San Francisco stretched beyond the glass, trolley bells in the distance, the faint hum of traffic rolling up the hill, but she heard none of it. On the small table beside her sat a cup of tea gone cold, forgotten since morning. Her eyes lingered instead on the folded stack of legal papers Samuel had sent over by courier. Her phone vibrated against the table, its screen lighting up with a name she wished she could erase as easily as Samuel had from her will. Catherine Hayes. Margaret let it buzz twice before it stilled. A few moments later, the message appeared. Sorry about the other night. I was stressed. Didn't mean for things to go that far. The words were clipped, distant, the kind of apology that demanded forgiveness without ever offering remorse. Margaret read them once, then again, and set the phone down with a deliberate calm. She did not reply. The silence seemed to agitate Catherine. Another message arrived minutes later, this one dressed up with false sweetness. You know how much I care about you. Let's not let one bad dinner ruin everything. Margaret sipped her cold tea, the bitterness fitting her mood. The phone buzzed again, this time a call. Catherine's name flashed insistently. Margaret let it ring until the line went dead. Almost immediately, a new message appeared. Michael thinks you're upset with me. Can we talk this through? I was only frustrated. Margaret's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something sterner. Frustrated? That was Catherine's word for humiliation, for the deliberate grind of a heel into her glasses, into her dignity. The phone rang again, not Catherine this time, Michael. Margaret hesitated only a moment before answering. Mom? His voice was careful, almost apologetic. Catherine says you're not speaking to her. Is everything okay? Margaret looked out the window, her gaze following a gull cutting across the orange sky. Her voice, when it came, was steady and cool. I'm fine. A pause stretched across the line. Michael shifted, his breath shallow. It didn't seem like it at dinner. I said, Margaret repeated, firmer this time, I'm fine. She ended the call before he could answer. Her phone remained silent for a few minutes, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Then Catherine struck again. You're being unfair. Everyone gets angry sometimes. Don't hold this against me. Another buzz. Another text, the words piling one on top of the other. I'm sorry if I hurt you. It wasn't that serious. You know I love Michael. Don't make this bigger than it is. Margaret let the screen glow and fade, each message appearing like a desperate knock on a door that would never open again. At last, she picked up the phone and typed slowly, her fingers deliberate on the keys. You're out of my life, Catherine. The decision has been made. She hit send and placed the phone back on the table. There was no satisfaction in it, not yet, only clarity. A line drawn cleanly, without tremor. For several minutes, there was silence. Then a final reply blinked onto the screen, colder than the rest. You'll regret this. Margaret read the words, her expression unchanged. She stood, walked to the mantel where the broken glasses lay like relics, and touched the cracked lens with her fingertip. The bitterness of Catherine's threat didn't frighten her. It only confirmed she had chosen the right path. She returned to her chair, calm once more. Outside, the sky deepened into twilight, the city's lights flickering awake one by one. The phone lay silent now, but Margaret knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Catherine was not the type to surrender gracefully. And Margaret was not the type to forgive. The morning after Catherine's last venomous text, Margaret woke to the sound of gulls circling over the bay. She moved through her home with deliberate calm, watering her ferns, feeding the cat that had once been George's, placing the cracked glasses back on the mantel where the light caught them like broken ice. Catherine's threat still lingered in her phone, but Margaret carried herself as though it were nothing more than static in the air. By late afternoon, Samuel called. His tone was crisp, his words clipped the way they were when he was containing irritation. She reached out, he said without preamble. Margaret didn't need to ask who. She simply raised an eyebrow, though Samuel couldn't see it. And? She wanted me to reconsider the amendments, said it was unfair. He paused, letting the words sour on his tongue. Her exact line was, I deserve something. It's family. Margaret's laugh was low, without humor. Entitlement dressed up as virtue. Did you entertain her? Not for a moment, Samuel said firmly. I told her what I'll tell you now. This is settled. She has no claim. Margaret's eyes lingered on the city skyline outside her window, bathed in a fading lavender glow. Then we're in agreement. She'll claw and scratch, but she won't touch what's mine. If Catherine had expected her backroom maneuvering to work, she underestimated Samuel. Yet Margaret knew her daughter-in-law well enough to recognize this was only the opening move. That evening, the phone began to hum again, not from Catherine directly this time, but from cousins and distant relatives, voices laced with concern. "Aunt Margaret, I heard you're struggling. Is everything all right? Michael mentioned you've been forgetful lately. Should we be worried?" Margaret sat at her writing desk, listening to each voice as though it were part of the same orchestrated choir. The script was clear. Catherine had shifted tactics. If she couldn't bend Samuel, she'd bend the family. She pictured Catherine's painted smile, whispering in living rooms, leaning across coffee shop tables, lowering her voice just enough to sound sincere. She's just not herself anymore. Maybe she's too old to be making big decisions. Margaret pressed her pen harder against the page of the letter she had been writing, the ink darkening with resolve. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself to the callers. She offered brief reassurances, calm and measured, and ended each call with polite finality. But when the last call ended, she sat back, letting her shoulders sink into the chair. The anger didn't come, not the hot, humiliating kind Catherine had tried to provoke at the dinner table. This was cooler, sharper, a blade honed rather than flung. Her piece was not ignorance, it was strategy. Later, Carol Harris stopped by, her voice as brash as ever as she set a bag of groceries on Margaret's counter. "I've been hearing the whispers," Carol said, her eyes narrowing. Catherine stirring the pot. "Claims you're losing it." Margaret poured her friend a glass of iced tea, unbothered. Let her talk. People will believe what they want to believe. I'm not wasting my breath proving otherwise. Carol snorted. "You've got more fire in you than half this city. If she thinks she can write your obituary early, she's got another thing coming." Margaret allowed herself the faintest smile. She'll learn soon enough. When Carol left, Margaret walked through the quiet rooms of her home. The weight of Catherine's rumor campaign lingered like fog seeping through cracked windows. But she felt strangely untouchable. Samuel had secured her estate. Her circle of friends knew her truth, and Catherine's reach, for all its venom, could not extend into Margaret's unshakable composure. She returned to the mantel, the broken glasses catching the dim lamplight. Her fingers hovered above them, tracing the air as though reminding herself of what had already been destroyed, and what Catherine could never again take from her. The phone buzzed once more. A new message from Michael. "Mom, we need to talk. Catherine says you're making mistakes you'll regret." Margaret stared at the screen, her face unreadable. For the first time, it wasn't Catherine's voice pressing against her resolve. It was her son's, pulled like a puppet by the woman he'd chosen. Her hand tightened around the phone, not in fear, but in decision. The storm arrived without warning. Margaret had just finished arranging fresh lilies in the vase by the window when the sharp rattle of the front doorknob jolted her. Before she could reach it, the door flew open, banging hard against the wall. Catherine swept in, heels striking the hardwood with a rhythm meant to dominate the space. Her coat hung open, her hair glossy and precise, her eyes lit with fury. Margaret didn't flinch. She set the last lily into the vase, adjusted its angle, and only then turned. "You had no right," Catherine spat, her voice slicing through the quiet. "No right to cut me out like that." Margaret's expression didn't change. "You're not family if you can't show respect." Her tone was even, clipped, as if stating a fact in a library where silence was expected. Catherine's laugh came brittle, too loud for the small room. "Respect? That's what this is about? You're punishing me because of a pair of glasses?" Margaret walked past her, calm, collected, and placed the watering can on the counter. "This isn't about glasses. It's about dignity." "Something you trampled, quite literally." "Unfair," Catherine snapped. "This decision, it's cruel, too harsh. You can't just erase me like I don't exist." Margaret finally turned, her eyes sharpening. "I didn't erase you, Catherine. You erased yourself when you decided humiliation was your weapon." For a moment, Catherine faltered, her jaw tightening, her bravado slipping. But she pressed forward, voice softer now, drenched in feigned hurt. "I was upset. I lashed out. Everyone loses their temper. Don't you think you're overreacting? Don't you think George would have wanted the family to stay together?" At the mention of her late husband, Margaret's hand brushed the mantel where his photograph stood, steadying herself. She didn't look away from Catherine. Don't use his name to excuse yourself. He believed in kindness and strength. You've shown me neither. Catherine's eyes narrowed. She stepped closer, lowering her voice as though the proximity might soften her words. You're making a mistake you'll regret, Michael. Margaret cut her off, her voice calm but cutting. Michael is blind right now, blinded by loyalty, by fear. But me? I see clearly, and what I see is a woman who crossed a line and thought she could charm her way back. Catherine's mouth trembled, caught between anger and the act of wounded innocence. She tried one last angle, her voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. I've tried with you, Margaret. Do you think it's easy, living under your shadow? You've never given me a chance. You've judged me from the start. Margaret's lips curved, not into a smile, but something sharper. I judged you the night you crushed my glasses and smirked, as though breaking me was a sport. That wasn't a lapse, Catherine. That was who you are. And now you've shown me your true colors. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with truths Catherine couldn't twist. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, her face reddening, the perfect composure she so carefully maintained slipping away. Margaret, however, remained still, composed, as though rooted deeper than the house itself. Her calm was impenetrable, her restraint a mirror in which Catherine could only see her own pettiness reflected back. Finally, Catherine hissed, her voice low and venomous. This isn't over. Margaret tilted her head slightly, her eyes unwavering. No, it's just beginning. Catherine spun on her heel, the door slamming behind her, leaving the scent of her perfume hanging acrid in the air. Margaret stood alone in the quiet, the lilies glowing softly in the afternoon light. She exhaled slowly, her hand brushing the cracked glasses on the mantel. They were still broken, but they no longer felt like a wound. They were a warning. Her phone vibrated on the table, the screen lit up. Samuel Green. Margaret pressed accept on the vibrating phone. Samuel's voice came through, low and deliberate. She's hired counsel, he said, wasting no time. An aggressive type, the kind who thinks intimidation counts as strategy. Margaret sank into her armchair, the lilies perfuming the air behind her. Let her hire an army. It won't change the truth. She's claiming you weren't of sound mind when we amended the will. Samuel's voice carried the faintest edge of contempt, mental incompetence, predictable as rain in January. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, her fingers grazing the cracked glasses on the mantel. Catherine thought she could rewrite history with slander, but Margaret's mind had never been sharper. What do you need from me? Margaret asked. Nothing but your patience, Samuel replied. I'll review the filings, prepare our response. The documents are clean, airtight. She's wasting her money. That night, Margaret brewed herself a fresh cup of tea, the steam curling in the lamplight. She imagined Catherine pacing in some polished downtown office, rehearsing her victimhood for a lawyer who'd already seen through it. The thought almost made her smile. By the following afternoon, Samuel summoned her to his office. His desk was spread with papers marked by legal stamps and signatures. He tapped a single sheet with his fountain pen. This is her formal complaint. She accuses you of being manipulated, unfit, even delusional. He looked up, his eyes sharp. Do you want to read it? Margaret shook her head. Her words don't deserve my time. Samuel's mouth twitched, almost approving. Wise. I've drafted the response. It's firm, factual, no embellishment. She'll have nowhere to hide. He read aloud, his voice steady. The petition is baseless and will not be entertained. Margaret leaned back, the words settling into her chest like anchors. Her pulse slowed, her breathing even. The fight Catherine was picking was already lost. She just didn't know it yet. That evening, Margaret received an unexpected call from Samuel again. His tone was drier this time, edged with restrained amusement. Her lawyer requested a meeting. Tried to pressure me into reconsidering. Talked about family unity and avoiding scandal. Samuel paused, his disdain clear. I reminded him the law doesn't bend for tantrums. Margaret allowed herself a rare laugh, a short exhale that filled the quiet of her living room. How did he take that? Like a child told no for the first time, Samuel replied. His threats were empty. He knows he doesn't have a case. Margaret pictured Catherine, rehearsing fury in her bathroom mirror, convinced the weight of her entitlement could force the world to heal. It almost saddened her, almost. But Catherine's arrogance had crossed into cruelty, and cruelty demanded consequence. Over the next week, letters flew back and forth between lawyers, full of sharp phrases and sterile formality. Margaret read none of them. She left them in Samuel's care, preferring the quiet of her garden, the company of Carol's sharp-tongued humor, and the steady rhythm of her days. Yet beneath that quiet, she felt something shift. Catherine was no longer playing behind her back. She was attacking in the open. The battlefield was set, and Margaret stood on ground Catherine could not touch. One evening, as Margaret settled into bed, her phone buzzed again, not with Catherine's name this time, but with an unfamiliar number. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Mrs. Hayes?" A male voice, curt, professional. "I represent Mrs. Catherine Hayes. We're giving you a chance to reconsider before we take this further. You don't want a public fight." Margaret lay back against her pillows, her voice cool as marble. "I'll leave the fighting to my lawyer. Good night." She ended the call without waiting for a reply. The silence afterward was absolute, almost triumphant. She reached for George's photograph on her nightstand, her thumb brushing the glass. "She thinks this is war," she whispered. "She hasn't even seen the battlefield." The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and stale coffee, the kind of scent that clung to a place where too many battles had been fought under the banner of law. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, slicing into the room in pale strips. Margaret sat at the respondent's table beside Samuel, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a simple navy suit, pearls at her throat, her hair brushed into its usual silver bob. If Catherine expected her to appear frail, she would find only composure. The doors opened, and Catherine entered with Michael at her side. Catherine's heels struck the marble floor like punctuation marks, loud, deliberate, meant to claim ownership of the room. Michael's shoulders sagged under the weight of proximity, his gaze sliding away from his mother's. Catherine took her place across the aisle, smoothing her skirt with theatrical precision. Her lawyer, a younger man with slicked hair and an overeager smile, leaned close to whisper in her ear. She nodded sharply, her eyes flashing with triumph before the first word was even spoken. When the judge entered, the courtroom rose. He was a man of measured presence, spectacles perched low on his nose, his expression suggesting he had seen every trick in the book and grown weary of them. "Let's begin," he said, his voice resonating across the room. Catherine's lawyer launched first. "Your Honor, my client has been unfairly disinherited under circumstances that raise serious concern. We contend that Mrs. Hayes was subjected to undue influence and was not fully competent at the time the will was amended." Samuel remained still until the lawyer finished, then rose with the calm certainty of a man carrying the truth in his pocket. "Your Honor," Samuel began, his voice steady, deliberate, "the evidence will show that Mrs. Hayes acted entirely of her own volition. She is of sound mind, fully aware of her decisions, and those decisions were made with clarity and independence. The will reflects her wishes, and her wishes alone." Catherine's lawyer smirked, circling like a showman. "We will argue that Mrs. Hayes was pressured, emotionally manipulated, perhaps even coerced into cutting my client out of her rightful place in this family." Samuel lifted a single sheet of paper from his file and placed it on the judge's bench. "This is the evaluation conducted less than a week before the amendments were signed. It affirms Margaret Hayes's full mental capacity, strong memory, sharp reasoning, no impairment." He glanced briefly at Catherine's lawyer. "It leaves no room for the fiction you're trying to spin." The judge adjusted his glasses, scanning the page. His brow lifted ever so slightly, unimpressed by the accusations laid before him. Still, Catherine's lawyer pressed on. "Your Honor, even if competence is established, there is the matter of emotional duress. Mrs. Hayes may have felt cornered, pressured by others to act out of anger rather than reason." Samuel's reply was swift, clipped. "Anger does not void autonomy. The law recognizes her right to act on her convictions, whether born of kindness or disappointment. And as her counsel, I can attest that she approached these decisions calmly, decisively, and without external influence." Margaret watched in silence, her gaze steady, her pulse calm. She had promised herself she would not rise to Catherine's bait, not in front of strangers, not in front of her son. Her presence alone would speak louder than any outburst. Catherine shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The confidence she had carried in on her stilettos faltered as her lawyer stumbled under Samuel's steady dismantling. Each rebuttal left him with less to stand on, his words less certain, his theatrics thinner. The judge's expression never softened, never hinted at sympathy. His eyes flicked between Catherine and Michael, then back to Margaret, who sat poised and silent, unflinching. When Catherine's lawyer attempted one final flourish, "Surely, Your Honor, you can see this was an act of spite, not of reason." The judge's gavel struck once. Sharp and decisive. "Enough," he said. "I've heard the arguments. The evidence will speak louder than speculation." The words landed heavy in the room, their meaning clear to anyone listening. Catherine's case was crumbling. Margaret's eyes never left her daughter-in-law's face. Catherine's smirk was gone now, replaced by a flicker of something rawer, panic perhaps, or the dawning realization that entitlement did not translate into victory. Margaret exhaled, slow and steady, the way one breathes after a long climb. She didn't need to win the moment, she only needed to endure it. The judge's chambers were still as a tomb when he returned. File in hand, glasses perched low. The shuffle of paper was the only sound, punctuated by the faint ticking of the courtroom clock. Everyone leaned forward, Margaret steady as stone, Catherine tight with anticipation, Michael shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The judge cleared his throat, his tone dry but authoritative. After reviewing the petition and the responses provided, the court finds no credible evidence that Mrs. Hayes was incompetent or coerced in her decisions regarding her estate. Catherine's hand twitched against the table, knuckles whitening. The judge continued, unhurried. On the contrary, the documents presented reflect careful preparation, witnessed and validated without dispute. The psychological evaluation submitted further confirms Mrs. Hayes's sound mental state at the time the amendments were executed. He looked up, his gaze heavy, decisive. Therefore, the claims brought forward by Mrs. Catherine Hayes and Mr. Michael Hayes are hereby dismissed. The gavel struck once, the sound echoing like thunder in a valley. Catherine's face drained of color, her mouth opening but no words escaping. The smirk she had worn like armor was gone, stripped clean by the judge's ruling. Michael leaned toward her, his lips parting as if to speak, but before he could, the judge lifted a hand. "This matter is concluded. Any further disruption will not be tolerated." Michael froze, his protest swallowed before it reached air. He lowered his head, shame and frustration carved into his features. Margaret sat motionless, then allowed herself a breath that was almost a smile. It was not triumph, not the gloating sort Catherine might have expected, but something quieter, deeper, vindication. The law had honored her decision. Her dignity had been preserved. Samuel gathered his papers with the calm of a man who had seen this outcome long before it arrived. "As I told you," he murmured, his voice carrying only to Margaret, ironclad. Across the aisle, Catherine's composure fractured further. She gripped Michael's arm, her whispers sharp, desperate, though the courtroom was too hushed to ignore them. "This isn't fair. She's stealing from us. From you." Michael looked toward his mother, meeting her eyes for the first time all morning. What he saw there wasn't anger. It was clarity, unyielding and unashamed. He turned away quickly, unable to hold her gaze. The bailiff gestured toward the doors, and Catherine rose, her movements stiff with indignation. She swept past Margaret without a glance, dragging Michael in her wake. The echo of her heels on the marble floor faded down the corridor until there was nothing left but silence. Margaret did not watch them leave. She straightened her papers, adjusted her pearls, and let the moment settle into her bones like a final note of music resolving. The broken glasses at home, the rumors whispered over coffee, the venom of Catherine's texts, it all seemed to fold neatly into this ruling, sealed by the authority of the court. As the room emptied, Margaret remained seated a moment longer. She wanted to feel the weight of the decision, to let the victory breathe before the world intruded again. Only when Samuel touched her elbow lightly did she rise. Together they walked toward the courthouse doors. Sunlight spilled across the floor, bright and sharp, catching the edge of Margaret's silver hair. Outside, the city bustled on, unaware of the battle that had just ended within its stone walls. Margaret paused on the steps, lifting her face into the light. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. George would have been proud. Yet even in the glow of vindication, Margaret knew Catherine well enough to recognize the truth. This defeat would not be her last attempt. As she descended the courthouse steps, her phone buzzed in her purse. A new message. Catherine Hayes. You may have won today, but this isn't over. Margaret's hand lingered on the phone, her grip steady. She slipped it back into her purse without opening it. Her silence, as always, would cut sharper than any reply. 2 mornings after the ruling, Margaret awoke to a sound she rarely paid attention to, the thud of the San Francisco Chronicle landing on her porch. She didn't subscribe, but Carol did, and Carol wasted no time calling. Page 3, Carol said, her voice bristling. You'd better sit down before you look. Margaret didn't sit. She stood at her kitchen counter, tea steaming beside her, and unfolded the paper with practiced patience. There it was. Family feud over estate raises questions of competence. Beneath the headline, a grainy courthouse photo of Margaret, her profile stern, Samuel at her side. The article quoted an unnamed source close to the family, claiming Margaret was no longer capable of managing her affairs, that she had been pressured into decisions she didn't understand. Margaret's lips thinned, but she folded the paper neatly and set it aside. She didn't need to guess who the source was. Catherine had taken her venom public. By noon, her phone was buzzing, not with Catherine's threats this time, but with neighbors, old library colleagues, women from her book club. Margaret, don't you worry. We know you better than that. She's desperate, that's all. Anyone can see through it. Can you believe she'd stoop this low? Their support wrapped around Margaret like a shield. For every ugly word printed, 10 more voices spoke in her defense. When Carol arrived at her door that evening with a casserole and a face red with outrage, she nearly slammed the dish onto the counter. She thinks she can smear you into submission, Carol fumed. What she doesn't realize is that half this city has borrowed a book from you, and they all know you've got more brains in your little finger than she'll ever have. Margaret smiled faintly, touched but not surprised. She had always believed that truth didn't need shouting, it simply needed patience. The next week, local talk shows latched onto the story. A radio host framed it as a battle of generations, but callers quickly dismantled Catherine's narrative. One after another, voices rang out. She's twisting the facts. Mrs. Hayes is sharp as a tack. I saw her give a speech at the library last month. That daughter-in-law sounds like trouble. By the time a television station aired a segment, the story had shifted. Catherine was no longer framed as a victim, but as a manipulator, her ambition laid bare for the public to see. At Samuel's office, Margaret watched the coverage in silence as the reporter quoted unnamed sources describing Catherine as calculating and self-serving. Samuel muted the television. The tide has turned. Public opinion isn't with her, it's against her. He leaned back, fingers steepled. And there's more. Her accusations have attracted the wrong kind of attention. She may be facing a defamation inquiry. Margaret stirred her coffee slowly, unbothered. Let her drown in her own lies. I don't need to raise my voice, Samuel studied her, then nodded. Your restraint is your greatest weapon. Keep it. And so she did. While Catherine flailed in the spotlight, Margaret carried on with her days, tending her garden, writing letters, attending her book club. She made no statements, gave no interviews. Her silence grew louder than any defense she might have spoken. But silence had a way of unsettling her enemies. Catherine's frustration leaked into every appearance, every whispered comment to anyone who would listen. Her edges frayed in public, her confidence splintered, until even Michael looked weary in the photos the press captured of them leaving restaurants or walking into offices. Margaret saw those images on the evening news, but she never lingered. The truth didn't need savoring. It was enough to let it stand. One evening, as she trimmed the roses in her garden, Carol appeared at the gate with a grin sharper than her shears. Guess what? Catherine's being investigated. Defamation. Samuel was right. Margaret clipped a rose, its petals falling into her palm like velvet. Then she's finally learning. You can't build a life on broken glass. Carol tilted her head. What do you mean? Margaret placed the rose into Carol's hand, her eyes calm. She'll find out soon enough. That night, Margaret set the cracked glasses on her nightstand, the fracture catching the moonlight. They were no longer just a wound or a warning. They were a reminder that some damage couldn't be undone, and some battles couldn't be won with force. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a message, short and bitter, from Michael this time. Mom, what are you doing to her? She's falling apart. The courtroom was smaller this time, less ceremonial, more clinical. The walls bore no grandeur, just beige paint and fluorescent lights humming overhead. But the gravity of what unfolded here was no less sharp. Margaret sat with Samuel once more, her posture dignified, her hands folded over her lap. She looked less like a woman on trial and more like a matriarch waiting for order to be restored. Across the aisle, Catherine's confidence had eroded to a brittle facade. Her tailored suit couldn't disguise the shadows beneath her eyes. The judge entered briskly, flipping through the folder before him. He spoke without theatrics. After a review of the evidence presented and testimony submitted, this court finds the defamation claims against Mrs. Margaret Hayes to be without merit. He set the papers down, gaze fixed on Catherine. Furthermore, the baseless nature of these allegations constitutes an abuse of legal process. Mrs. Hayes, your behavior warrants a formal reprimand. The gavel cracked once. Catherine's composure cracked with it. Her face flushed red, her lips parted as if to protest. But no sound came. Michael shifted uncomfortably beside her, his hands tightening into fists on his knees. Samuel leaned slightly toward Margaret, voice low and calm. It's done. She's finished. Margaret gave a single nod. Not of triumph, but of confirmation. She had never doubted this outcome. Outside the courthouse, the air was sharp with autumn wind. Reporters lingered, but none approached Margaret. Her silence had become legendary by now, her refusal to fuel Catherine's fire admired as much as it was feared. She stepped past the crowd, pearls glinting in the weak sunlight, leaving Catherine to face the storm alone. 2 days later, Michael appeared at her doorstep. He stood awkwardly in the frame, his eyes tired, his tie crooked as though he'd lost the habit of order. Mom, he began, his voice uneven. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Margaret held the door, but didn't invite him in. For what exactly? He swallowed hard. For not standing up, for letting it get this far. Catherine. She pushed me, but I should have known better. Margaret studied him, her expression unreadable. And yet you didn't. I'm sorry, he said again, softer this time. I can't undo it, but I want you to know I regret it. Her eyes softened, but only slightly. Regret isn't the same as responsibility, Michael. She let the words linger between them, a truth heavier than any embrace. Then, with calm finality, she added, I accept your apology, but things won't go back to how they were. Michael lowered his head. A man who understood the door behind him was more than wood. It was history, and it was closing. Weeks passed. Catherine's smear campaign collapsed under its own weight. Her name appeared in whispers in the Chronicle now, not headlines. Baseless lawsuit, public reprimand, fall from grace. Each phrase chipped away at the image she had built, leaving her reputation hollow. Bills mounted. The boutique she had boasted about over dinner was shuttered, windows papered over with for lease signs. Friends who once clung to her orbit peeled away, unwilling to be dragged down with her. Even Michael, loyal to a fault, began pulling back, silence stretching between them like a canyon. Margaret watched it unfold from a distance, not with glee, but with the serene assurance that justice had a rhythm of its own. She spent her mornings in the garden, her afternoons reading in the bay window, her evenings sharing tea with Carol. Peace, once elusive, had returned like a long-lost guest. Then, one crisp morning, Carol arrived at her door, cheeks flushed with gossip. She's moved out, she said, almost breathless. Catherine packed her things and left Michael's condo. Word is she went crawling back to her parents. Margaret set her teacup down, her expression calm, almost indifferent. Then the house is quiet again. Carol leaned closer, voice conspiratorial. She's done, Margaret. Really done. Margaret's eyes drifted to the mantel where the cracked glasses still rested. They caught the sunlight, fractured into sharp angles. "No, Carol," she said softly. "She's desperate, and desperation is never done." Winter settled over San Francisco with a gentler hand than most years, and Margaret felt the shift not just in the air, but in her own bones. The chaos Catherine had unleashed was gone, replaced by a steady rhythm of days that belonged to her again. Her mornings began in the library reading room downtown, not as an employee but as a patron turned benefactor. The staff greeted her warmly, many of them younger women who had grown up borrowing books under her watchful eye. They now worked under grants, funded by the very foundation Margaret had quietly nurtured in the past year. Scholarships for students, programs for single mothers, literacy drives across the city. Her reputation, once dragged through courthouse mud, had been burnished into something larger than before. People no longer saw only a retired librarian. They saw a matriarch who had weathered fire without bowing to it. At community meetings, neighbors pressed her hand, voices tinged with gratitude. "You've done more for this neighborhood in a year than the city council has in a decade." Margaret listened, nodded politely, never seeking the spotlight. But when she walked home, the glow of street lamps seemed warmer, as though the city itself acknowledged her. Meanwhile, Catherine's name all but vanished from polite conversation. Whispers reached Margaret through Carol, who kept a keen ear on gossip. The boutique never reopened. Catherine's credit crumbled. Lawsuits drained what little she had left. Finally, the inevitable. She moved back into her parents' suburban house, a fall from marble countertops to childhood wallpaper. Michael still called on occasion, his voice heavier each time. "She isn't the same," he admitted once, late at night, when the sound of his loneliness bled through the line. "I thought I knew who she was. I didn't." Margaret had no venom left for him, only the quiet truth. We see people clearly when the shine wears off. That's when the choice becomes ours. He didn't answer right away, and Margaret let the silence hold. He would have to reckon with his own choices, the way she had with hers. For Margaret, peace meant simple things again. Pruning roses in her garden, sharing tea with Carol, writing letters at her desk by the bay window. The absence of Catherine's shadow left room for light to pour in. One afternoon, as she sorted through the day's mail, she paused at a small envelope written in careful, uneven script. Inside was a letter from a young woman who had received one of Margaret's foundation scholarships. "Mrs. Hayes, because of you, I'm the first in my family to attend college. I want you to know your generosity has changed not just my life, but my little sister's too. She believes she can do it because she saw me do it. Thank you for giving us that hope." Margaret read the words twice, then folded the letter and pressed it to her chest. It was heavier than Catherine's lawsuits, louder than the rumors, more lasting than any smear campaign. This was the legacy that mattered, not wealth, not property, but impact. That evening, she placed the letter beside the cracked glasses on the mantel. One was a symbol of the cruelty she had endured, the other of the good she had built from it. Together, they told the story of who she was now, scarred but unbroken, quiet but unshakable. As the fire in the hearth dwindled to embers, Margaret poured herself a glass of wine. The city lights blinked beyond her window, alive with stories she would never know. But here, in her home, the narrative was hers, alone. She raised her glass slightly toward George's photograph, catching the glint of his smile. "We did it, love. We turned her malice into something that will outlast us both." The phone buzzed on the table, interrupting the quiet. She frowned, expecting Carol or perhaps Samuel. Instead, the name glowing on the screen stopped her breath for a beat. Catherine Hayes. The name on her phone screen glowed like a ghost. Margaret let it ring once, twice, until silence returned. She set the phone face down on the table, her glass of wine untouched beside it. Catherine Hayes was still reaching, even from the ruins, but Margaret had no interest in being her lifeline. Weeks passed, and Catherine's name slipped further from public lips. She was no longer mentioned in society columns or whispered about in boutiques. She became a shadow that people recalled vaguely. A cautionary tale murmured with a shake of the head. Even Michael, still tethered to her, seemed to vanish into the same obscurity. Margaret, by contrast, stepped quietly into a different kind of prominence. Her foundation grew. Local newspapers carried articles not about scandals, but about scholarships, literacy programs, and neighborhood revitalization. Photographs of Margaret appeared not in courthouse halls, but in community centers, surrounded by young women smiling with fresh diplomas, children clutching new books. At one luncheon downtown, a former colleague from the library pulled her aside. "Margaret, do you realize what you've done? You've become the model for what it means to leave something meaningful behind. Not money, not property, impact." Margaret smiled politely, accepting the praise with the same quiet grace she accepted everything else. She never boasted, never reminded anyone of the fight it had taken to reach this point. The satisfaction was not in being seen. It was in knowing she had turned pain into permanence. Meanwhile, Michael called less often. When he did, his voice carried weariness, like a man dragging chains. "Mom," he said one evening, "things with Catherine, they're hard. She doesn't leave the house much. She's not who she was." Margaret listened, her silence steady on the line. At last she said, "Who she was is why you're here now." He didn't argue, but he didn't visit either. The distance between them was a wound Margaret had learned to live with. Some scars were meant to remind, not to heal. Spring arrived. The garden bloomed in bright colors, the roses fuller than ever. Margaret hosted gatherings at her home, small dinners for community leaders, quiet evenings where young women she mentored would sit in her living room, notebooks in hand, eager for her counsel. She spoke not of Catherine, nor of courts or wills, but of endurance, dignity, and choice. "Strength isn't about shouting," she told one group of women, her voice calm but unwavering. "It's about knowing when silence is stronger. People reveal themselves if you let them talk long enough. The key is, don't let them define you in the process." They scribbled down her words, eyes bright. Margaret saw pieces of her younger self in them, steady, searching, unwilling to bow. Passing on that steadiness felt more satisfying than any verdict a judge could render. Then, one gray afternoon, Catherine tried again. A letter this time, delivered by hand. Margaret found it in her mailbox, the handwriting unmistakable. She carried it inside, placed it on the table, and sat for a long while before opening it. The words were messy, sprawling across the page, ink smudged as if written in haste. Catherine spoke of regret, of mistakes, of wanting to repair what was broken. "Michael still loves you. I want us to heal as a family. Please. I can't do this alone anymore." Margaret read it once, then again. She folded the paper neatly, slid it back into its envelope, and set it beside the cracked glasses on the mantel. There it would remain, not as an invitation, but as a relic. When Carol visited later that evening, Margaret gestured to the letter. "She's still reaching." Carol raised an eyebrow. "And?" Margaret poured them both tea, her tone even. "And I'm not reaching back. Some bridges are better left in ashes." The fire in the hearth popped, sending sparks upward. The envelope lay still, untouched, its plea unanswered. Margaret turned to the window, where the city lights blinked awake against the dusk. Beyond the glass stretched a skyline that had seen her broken, seen her rise, and now saw her reign in quiet steadiness. Her life had settled into a rhythm she had chosen, free from Catherine's shadow. She mentored, she gave, she lived. The peace was not fragile anymore. It was rooted, steady, her own. But as the evening deepened, she glanced once more at the envelope on the mantel. The silence she kept was powerful, but it also carried a question. How long before Catherine's desperation twisted into something darker? The envelope on the mantel remained untouched, its edges curling slightly as days turned into weeks. Margaret never moved it, never burned it, never read it again. It lived there as a reminder of what she had survived and what she refused to return to. On a quiet Sunday morning, she sat at her desk by the bay window, pen in hand, paper spread before her. Outside, the fog was lifting, sunlight creeping down the hills toward the bay. The city hummed faintly in the distance, but here the only sound was the scratch of ink across paper. "To my grandchildren," she began, her handwriting steady. "One day when you're grown, you will hear fragments of stories about me. I want you to know the truth, Not the headlines, not the whispers, but what truly matters. She paused, looking out at the water where the light shimmered. Memory stirred, the shattering crunch of her glasses under Catherine's heel, the silence of Michael at the dinner table, the humiliation she had carried home in her purse. She let the ache surface, but only briefly, before guiding her pen again. People will try to test you, to belittle you, to convince you that you are smaller than you are. Don't waste your strength on shouting. Let your dignity be the loudest voice in the room. The words flowed more easily than she expected. She wrote not just of Catherine, but of endurance, of patience, of building something stronger from the ashes of betrayal. She wanted her grandchildren to understand that legacy wasn't measured in dollars, but in steadiness. You cannot control what others do, but you can control how you answer. And sometimes, the strongest answer is silence. She set the pen down, flexing her hand, then folded the pages carefully into an envelope marked, simply, for my grandchildren. Later that week, Carol arrived with her usual chatter and a basket of oranges from the market. Margaret laughed as her old friend complained about the grocer's prices, but her eyes softened when Carol mentioned Catherine. She's barely seen in town anymore, Carol said, settling into a chair. Word is, her parents are tired of supporting her. She's unraveling. Margaret poured tea, steady as always. And still, I owe her nothing. Let her unravel. The foundation occupied more of her time now. New initiatives took root. Reading programs in underserved schools, support groups for widows, community gardens springing up on neglected lots. Margaret attended board meetings, offered guidance, but rarely put herself at the center. It wasn't about her. It was about the women who came after, the ones who needed the steadiness she had fought to preserve. One afternoon, as she toured a new library wing funded by her foundation, a young mother pressed her hand, eyes wet with gratitude. You don't know what this means for my daughter, she said. Margaret smiled, her voice gentle but firm. Then make sure she knows books are power. That's all the thanks I'll ever need. Meanwhile, Michael appeared at her door again, shoulders heavy but eyes clearer than before. He carried no excuses this time, only a tentative respect. Mom, he said, his voice low, I didn't realize how strong you were. I didn't want to see it, but I do now. Margaret studied him, then opened the door wider. She didn't embrace him, didn't erase the years of pain, but she allowed him inside. That was enough. Days melted into a rhythm of peace. Margaret tended her roses, mentored young women who visited her living room, and shared laughter with Carol over simple meals. On quiet evenings, she took walks with Carolyn Harris, Carol's granddaughter, whose bright questions and unfiltered joy reminded Margaret of the future she was protecting. One evening, as Carolyn twirled in the garden, chasing fireflies, Margaret leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. The past felt distant now, not erased, never erased, but muted beneath the weight of all she had built. The cracked glasses still sat on the mantel, alongside the sealed letter to her grandchildren. Two relics, one of cruelty, one of legacy. Both told her story, but only one would outlast her. As night fell and the house grew still, Margaret whispered into the quiet. The story I lived is not the story she tried to write. The phone buzzed on the desk, vibrating against the wood. This time it wasn't Catherine's name, nor Michael's. It was a number she didn't recognize, yet something in her chest tightened. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, their light catching the crystal glasses and silver cutlery laid out on white draped tables. A banner stretched across the stage, Hayes Foundation Annual Gala. The hum of conversation filled the space, politicians, community leaders, and former students whose futures Margaret had helped shape. Margaret stood at the edge of the stage, pearl necklace resting against her collarbone, her silver gray bob immaculate. Samuel hovered nearby, Carol at her other side, both of them proud in their quiet ways. When the host announced her name, the applause rose like a wave. Margaret walked to the podium unhurried, her steps steady, each click of her heels echoing against the polished floor. She gripped the lectern lightly, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. I stand before you, she began, her voice low but firm, not as someone who lived a flawless life, but as someone who learned the cost of silence. and its power. The room hushed. She spoke of resilience, of dignity, of how her late husband's values had shaped her. She spoke of the foundation, not as a monument to her name, but as a promise to the generations who would follow. We cannot always choose what others do to us, but we can choose what we build from it. I chose to build something that will outlast cruelty, that will turn bitterness into growth. Eyes glistened across the room. Young women nodded. Older ones held their hands over their hearts. The applause that followed shook the chandeliers, but Margaret simply bowed her head once and stepped aside. By the end of the evening, pledges had surpassed every milestone the foundation had aimed for. A new library wing, additional scholarships, even a citywide literacy festival. Her work was expanding faster than she had dared to dream. Meanwhile, Catherine and Michael had vanished from the public eye entirely. Their names appeared only in hushed tones, neighbors whispering about foreclosure, about separations and unpaid debts. Once, Margaret might have mourned the shadow her son had chosen to live under. Now she accepted it as the cost of his decisions. Her life no longer bent toward their chaos. Back at home, the gala's applause still echoing faintly in her mind. Margaret slipped off her heels and walked barefoot through her garden. The roses glowed in the moonlight, full and lush, their thorns hidden beneath the bloom. She leaned against the gate, breathing in the night air, calm as she had ever been. Her home was no longer heavy with battles fought, but light with victories earned. The cracked glasses remained on the mantel, beside the sealed letter to her grandchildren, relics that told the story of her strength more clearly than any plaque or award could. In the weeks that followed, she returned to her quiet routines, mentoring younger women in her living room, writing notes of encouragement to scholarship recipients, sitting on her porch with Carol and watching Carolyn chase fireflies across the lawn. Each small act deepened the peace she had carved for herself. One afternoon, Margaret sat alone at her writing desk, the bay window open to let in the breeze. She looked out over the garden she had cultivated, each flower bed precise, each rose bush blooming. Her hand rested on George's photograph, thumb brushing the frame. "I kept my promise," she whispered. "I protected what we built, and I gave it back to the world." Her reflection in the glass was older now, but her eyes were sharp, steady, the eyes of a woman who had endured humiliation, faced down betrayal, and emerged untouchable. She picked up her pen and began another letter for her foundation's archives. Words came easily now, threaded with the clarity of a woman who had nothing left to prove. And as evening fell, she stepped into her garden once more, the roses swaying in the twilight, the city's lights glowing beyond the hills. She felt no fear, no lingering resentment, only the satisfaction of a life lived on her terms. She thought back to that night at the dinner table, to the crunch of her glasses under Catherine's heel, to the smirk that had once cut her to the bone. Margaret smiled faintly, steady as ever, and whispered into the quiet. My daughter-in-law smashed my glasses on the ground in front of my son and smirked. "You don't deserve these," so I made sure she didn't deserve a penny of my estate.